Would you accept an impossible challenge if you knew it was created only to humiliate you? A billionaire laughed, pointed, and said without thinking twice, "I'll give you 500 million if you can open the vault." What he didn't expect is that the barefoot boy standing in front of him didn't need strength, influence, or power, that he only needed something money can never buy: logic. Today you'll discover how a bet meant to ridicule ended up exposing an entire empire, turning the internet upside down, and changing a family's destiny forever. Stay until the end, because what happens after the vault opens is even more impactful than the challenge itself. And if stories like this make you reflect, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of them. Dean woke up before the sun because the silence of dawn was the only moment when the world didn't push him out of the way. The cold floor of the simple house touched his bare feet as he got up without making a sound. The patched clothes, sewn many times by his own mother, were already folded on the chair. There was no hot coffee and no childish rush, only responsibility that came too early. Dean knew that if he was late, everything fell behind with him. Time was not a friend to those who depended on him. That he took a deep breath before leaving, like someone preparing to disappear. That day, like all the others, no one would ask how he was doing. Because Dean was not seen as a child, that he was seen as a function. The building's lobby was large, clean, and shining, but to Dean it felt like a stage where he could only walk through the shadows. While executives crossed the space speaking loudly, he moved quietly, almost apologizing to the air. The old cloth in his hand slid over the expensive marble, erasing marks that weren't his. Every step had to be calculated so he wouldn't get in the way of anyone important. Expensive shoes passed by him as if he were part of the floor. No one said good morning. No one asked his name. Dean learned early that invisibility makes no noise, that IT simply weighs, and it weighs heavily. His small hands were already rough, cracked by the strong cleaning chemicals. The chemical smell clung to his skin like a constant reminder of the place assigned to him that he scrubbed carefully, because any mistake became a scolding, any splash became blame. Dean knew he couldn't make mistakes, even though he was just a boy. Mistakes cost more when you have nothing. While he cleaned, he watched the reflections in the glass. That he saw people who didn't see him. That he saw power moving in a hurry. That he saw distance. Dean's posture was always the same: head down, short steps, minimal presence. Not just out of fear, but out of learning. That he learned that taking up less space hurts less. That he learned that silence avoids problems. That he learned that explaining is exhausting and changes nothing. The building taught this every day without words. The shine of the place didn't light everyone equally. For some it was luxury. For him it was survival. And surviving required disappearing. Even so, there was something different about him. While he cleaned, Dean mentally counted the steps between the columns. That he observed patterns on the floor, repetition of shapes, symmetry. Numbers appeared in his head without effort. That he couldn't explain it, he just felt it. As if the world spoke a language only he could hear. That IT was a silent game that helped him endure the day. Each mental calculation was a refuge. A place where no one could tell him to leave. A place that was only his. Dean didn't complain. Not because he didn't feel tired, but because he didn't see anyone to complain to. Pain, when it finds no ears, learns to stay quiet. That he accepted orders with a quick nod. That he accepted verbal shoves as part of the invisible uniform. His small body already carried the weight of the entire household. Every movement was energy conservation. Every silence was defense. Every cleaning task was a promise of medicine at the end of the day. That he knew exactly why he was there. The clock high on the wall marked hours that felt longer for him. Dean measured time by the ache in his back, not by the hands on the clock. When someone complained about a delayed meeting, he thought about how many buckets were still left. The world seemed divided between those who command and those who endure, and he was on the side that endures. But even there, something inside him didn't break. Something observed, recorded, learned. As if that place was teaching without knowing it. As if the invisible was storing strength. Something was building up. Sometimes someone almost tripped over him and cursed. Dean apologized even when it wasn't his fault. It was automatic, like breathing. His dignity hid in small gestures. In finishing the job properly. In not returning the rudeness. In protecting his mother without saying a word. That he knew that being seen could be dangerous. So he chose not to be. But that was about to change. On that particular day, the air in the building felt different. There was tension in the footsteps, urgency in the phone calls, eyes paying too much attention. Dean noticed before any announcement that he always noticed first. Something important was about to happen. Something that would make noise. And noise never went well with invisibility. As he wiped the lobby floor one last time, Dean felt, without understanding how, that this place would still look at him. And when the world finally decides to look at someone it has always ignored, it doesn't usually ask for permission. Dean didn't know it yet, but the silence he carried was about to be broken. Not by a shout, but by something far more uncomfortable for those in power. Something no one there expected. Something that would begin with a simple interruption, and go straight to the heart of that building. Because invisibility has a limit. Leo Silva moved through the building as if he owned the territory, even when his name wasn't on every wall. The sound of his shoes on the marble announced his presence before his voice. Not because it was loud, but because everyone had learned to listen. Where Leo passed, conversations softened, laughter faded, postures straightened. That he liked that effect. That it was daily confirmation that power worked. To Leo, respect didn't come from connection, it came from fear. And fear was efficient. That it always had been. It always would be. He didn't see people, he saw utility. Those who served stayed. Those who got in the way left. In his logic, everything needed a clear function. Feeling was noise, empathy was delay. Too many people thinking became a problem. Leo preferred fast decisions even if they crushed someone along the way, and if someone got crushed, the fault was never his. It was the system, the business, the reality. Big words to justify small acts. And cruel ones. Anything outside the standard irritated him deeply. A delayed elevator. A cup out of place. A person where they shouldn't be. He exploded over details, but called it high standards. He said excellence was expensive. And someone always paid that bill. The employees knew it. That's why they avoided crossing his path. That's why they looked away. That's why they pretended not to see what he didn't want to see. Including Dean. To Leo, the building was an extension of his ego. Clean, organized, efficient. And anything that didn't match that image bothered him. He didn't like being reminded that there were people cleaning up what others dirted. He didn't like being confronted with invisible effort. He preferred to think everything simply worked. As if luxury were automatic. As if comfort didn't have hands behind it. And when those hands appeared, he felt offended. As if reality had dared to cross the glass. That's how he saw. Leo took pride in his own story, but only the part he told. He talked about merit, vision, courage. He never talked about the initial push, the open doors, the quiet help. His past was an edited narrative, and the higher he climbed, the farther he got from the ground. He convinced himself he owed nothing to anyone. That everything was pure achievement. That belief made him hard, and hardness turned into contempt. Especially for those below. Especially for those who cleaned. When Leo entered the lobby, he didn't see the space. He saw a calling card. And calling cards can't have flaws. Any detail out of place was a personal affront. He didn't ask who was there. He ordered them out. He didn't want stories, causes, or reasons. He didn't want context. Context slows decisions, and Leo liked deciding fast. Even when he was wrong, especially when he was wrong. Because admitting error was weakness. And he never showed weakness. At least that's what he believed. That day, Leo was already irritated. Meetings, numbers, pressure, expectations. Everything piled up like gunpowder, and gunpowder needs a spark. He walked through the building looking for order. Looking for control. Looking for something to unload the tension on, and without realizing it, his eyes crossed the lobby, not looking for people, but looking for problems, and he found something that, to him, shouldn't have been there. An out-of-place discomfort. Something too small to draw attention, but enough to strike the spark. Leo's gaze stopped where it never usually stopped. On the floor. Or rather, on someone too close to the floor. Dean was cleaning, focused, trying not to get in the way, trying not to exist. But to Leo, that presence was a flaw. A break in the aesthetic. An error in the scene, and errors needed to be corrected. Quickly, with authority, without explanation. He took a deep breath. That wouldn't be an ordinary day for anyone there. Not for the invisible boy, and not for the untouchable owner. Because when power feels challenged, even without any intention, it reacts. And it reacts loudly. Leo didn't know it yet, but that banal irritation was about to open something much bigger than a conflict. Something that can't be resolved with shouting. Or with orders. Something that starts small, but grows fast. And that would expose not just the building but Leo himself. Bia sensed the tension before Leo's voice cut through the air. She knew that rhythm, that heavy silence that came before the explosion. Working near Leo taught you how to read invisible signs, the quicker steps, the clenched jaw, the look that didn't seek dialogue. Bia took a deep breath, trying to get ahead of the disaster. She saw Dean on the floor, focused on his work, unaware of what was approaching, and in that instant, she knew something unfair was about to happen. The kind of thing no one later takes responsibility for. The kind of thing that leaves marks. When Leo stopped in the middle of the lobby, the entire space froze. Bia stood up almost at the same second, driven by an impulse that mixed fear and courage. She knew intervening had a cost. But she also knew staying silent cost more. Before Leo could speak, she stepped forward, her voice firm but respectful. She said everything was under control, she said the boy was working, she said there was no problem there at all. The words came out fast, like someone trying to put out a fire with a cup of water. She knew it might not work. Even so, she tried. Leo slowly turned his face toward her. Not with surprise, but with displeasure that he didn't like being interrupted. Even less being corrected. His expression shifted from irritation to cold contempt. Bia felt the impact before he even answered. When he spoke, his voice was low and cutting, that he said she was getting involved where she didn't belong, that he said he didn't pay a salary to a janitor's lawyer, that he said the building wasn't a place for those kinds of scenes. Each word was an invisible shove, each syllable a warning. Bia tried to keep her posture. She explained that the boy wasn't bothering anyone, that he was part of the routine, that he was there every day. But Leo didn't want explanations, that he wanted submission, and the more she spoke, the more challenged he felt. His tone rose. Not in volume, but in humiliation, that he made sure everyone heard, that he turned her defense into a reason for mockery. And the silence around them became involuntary complicity. Employees pretended to work, but they heard everything. No one moved, no one helped. Bia felt that familiar weight of being alone while trying to do the right thing. She noticed looks asking her to stop. Looks saying, "It's not worth it." But there was a boy there, barefoot, too small to carry that embarrassment, and that wouldn't leave her mind. Even with her throat tight, she insisted one more time. She tried to humanize the situation. That's when Leo finally lost his patience. He cut her off with a sharp gesture. That he said he didn't want a moral lesson, that he said she should worry about his schedule, and not about social problems. The phrase hung in the air like something dirty. Social problems. As if Dean were a defect in the world. As if his existence were an administrative error. Bia felt her face grow hot. Not from shame, from contained indignation. She knew any step beyond that could cost her job. But she also knew she had gone too far to pretend everything was normal. Leo ended the discussion the way someone slams a door in another person's face. That he turned his back, gave a short order, and kept walking, certain he had won. The building slowly began to breathe again, but something had broken. Bia sat back down, feeling the weight of helplessness. She looked at Dean, who remained quiet, head down, as if nothing had happened. That hurt more than the shouting, because it showed how used to it he was. And how none of it was new to him. Bia leaned in slightly and whispered an apology that shouldn't have been hers to give. Dean didn't respond with words. That he just nodded faintly. A small gesture. Far too mature for someone his age. She realized then that there were stories she didn't know. Things that couldn't be fixed with a quick defense. Something about that boy didn't match the role they gave him, and that realization kept pounding in her head. Because sometimes injustice reveals more than it hides. And sometimes someone's silence carries truths far too big. Bia didn't know it yet, but her attempt to contain the damage had only pushed the situation to another level. What seemed like an isolated humiliation was beginning to pull hidden threads. Stories that didn't fit inside a luxury lobby, truths that can't be cleaned away with a cloth and chemical products. And the next step of this story wasn't with Leo, nor with her. It lay with something no one there had stopped to ask. Who, in fact, was that boy? The truth didn't come as a dramatic revelation. It emerged simply, almost timidly, as if it didn't want to cause trouble. Bia found out little by little, through scattered remarks, quiet conversations in the hallways. Dean wasn't an employee. He never had been. He was Marta's son. The woman who cleaned the floors before everyone else arrived. The woman who left when no one needed to look anymore. A constant presence whose name few people knew. And suddenly, everything began to make sense. The boy wasn't there by choice. He was there out of necessity. Marta had worked in that building for years. Always discreet, always punctual, always invisible, the kind of employee only noticed when she's absent. She cleaned as if grateful to still have a job. Never complained, never asked for anything beyond the basics, because asking also exhausts you, and Marta already came from home exhausted by life, exhausted from carrying everything alone. Dean was the silent extension of that exhaustion. Dean's father was named Estevan. Before the illness, he was the one who carried most of the weight, hardworking, present, proud, until the day his body failed without warning. An accident. A limitation that never went away. Since then, Estevan could barely stay on his feet for long. Doctors talked about expensive treatments. The medications were constant. The income disappeared quickly. And dignity began to be negotiated through small daily concessions. Like sending a child to help. Estevan started selling candy on the street, with difficulty, with shame, with persistence. He left early, came back late, counting coins. Each sale was an attempt to keep the household running. Each day was an impossible equation. Marta did what she could, worked extra shifts, accepted worse hours, And still it wasn't enough. Dean saw everything: that he saw his father struggling without results, that he saw his mother bending in silence. And without being asked, he decided he would help. That's how he ended up in the lobby. Dean didn't cry when he started working. He simply understood that studying would have to wait, that he understood that playing was a luxury, that he understood that childhood didn't fit in the budget, that he followed his mother because it was cheaper than leaving him at home. And because there, at least, he was close to her. Dean cleaned because he could. Because it helped. Because it was that or no medicine. And when someone asked, he answered briefly. Not out of shyness, but because explaining too much hurts. And no one seemed truly interested in listening. Bia felt a strange tightness as she put the pieces together. The invisible boy gained a story, gained context, gained a name. Dean wasn't negligence, that he was consequence, that he wasn't a problem, that he was an improvised solution. And realizing that made everything heavier. Leo's look, his words, the contempt. None of it had been mere rudeness, that it had been comfortable ignorance. The kind that doesn't want to know because knowing forces change. And change is inconvenient. Meanwhile, Dean kept working the same way, without dramatizing, without complaining. Like someone who had already accepted the role assigned to him, that he knew the household depended on it, that he knew his father was waiting for medicine, that he knew his mother pretended to be strong because of him. So he did what needed to be done. Even if no one saw, even if no one thanked him. Even if no one asked what he had left behind. And there was something he had left behind. Something that hadn't yet been said. Something that was beginning to weigh in a different way. Because before brooms and cloths, Dean had notebooks, that he had numbers, that he had a talent that didn't fit into that routine. And that part of the story was still hidden. Waiting for the right moment to appear. Like everything silenced too early, and when it does appear, it usually surprises those who never paid attention. School was never an ordinary place for Dean. It was the only space where he didn't have to disappear. Between worn notebooks and short pencils, he felt whole. Numbers made sense to him in an almost natural way. While others memorized, Dean understood that he saw logic where his classmates saw difficulty, that he added quickly, solved problems without fear, found shortcuts. Teachers noticed, but didn't always know what to do with it. Talent without structure is often ignored. And little by little, it was. Dean especially loved math class. That was where the world felt organized. Every problem had a solution. Every mistake taught something. Unlike life at home, where effort didn't always fix things. In math, there was fairness, that if you thought it through, you got there. That gave him a rare sense of control, a feeling he kept like a secret. Because not every talent survives early exposure. Sometimes it's safer to protect it. Over time, the absences began to appear. First one missed day. Then two, then an entire week. Dean made simple excuses: headaches, helping at home, problems no one investigated too closely, until the absences became routine. The backpack grew lighter. The notebook stopped moving. And math started happening only in his head, between one bucket and another. Marta tried to insist. She said school was important, that he needed to study, but she said it tired, with guilt in her eyes, because she knew she couldn't demand what she couldn't sustain. Money didn't stretch. Medicine came first, food came first, rent came first, and so, without anyone saying it out loud, school became a luxury, the family couldn't afford at that moment. Dean understood without arguing. At first, he promised he would go back. That it was just a phase, that things would settle down soon. But days passed and nothing settled. The notebook was forgotten under the bed. Mental calculations grew looser. Without paper, he solved imaginary problems while cleaning the floor. Turned signs into numbers. Doors into sequences. Clocks into divisions. It was the way he found not to lose everything. Even without knowing if he would ever use it again. At school, Dean's name slowly faded. First among classmates. Then among teachers. Until he became just another student who didn't continue. These stories are too common to draw attention. No one asks why. No one follows what comes after. And talent disappears in silence. As if it never existed. As if it were never real. Dean felt that, but didn't know how to put it into words. He just felt a strange tightness whenever he passed near the school. In the building, no one imagined any of this. To them, Dean was just the boy who cleaned. They didn't see what he carried in his mind. They didn't see what he had left behind. They didn't see what was being wasted there every day. But the curious thing was that the building was full of numbers, codes, systems, passwords, panels. Everything spoke the language Dean understood, even without ever having spoken to him. And little by little, that detail was beginning to matter. Because when someone learns too early how to solve problems without help, he doesn't forget, he just waits. And Dean was waiting without knowing it. Waiting for something that didn't yet have a name, but was coming fast. Something that would require exactly what he thought he had lost. Something that would make everyone there remember school, math, and the mistake of believing knowledge has a social class. The building was running at its normal pace when the routine suffered a small deviation. No alarms. No announcements. Just an elevator that took longer than usual. Dean noticed first, as always, that he was cleaning near the entrance when he saw the man step out, that he wasn't wearing a typical suit. No badge, that he carried a rigid, dark briefcase, with discreet labels and security markings. The kind of object that doesn't belong to improvisation. The kind of thing that changes the atmosphere of a place without making a sound. The courier walked carefully, like someone transporting something that couldn't go wrong. Every step was measured. Every movement deliberate. Dean watched in silence. There was something different about that case. That it wasn't heavy by the man's effort, but by the way he held it. As if he weren't carrying just an object, but responsibility. The metal edges reflected the lobby light. The lock was far too complex to be decorative. Dean couldn't explain it, but he felt a curious chill. Something there spoke. The language of numbers. The man asked for directions in a low voice. That he didn't want attention, that he wanted discretion. Bia was called. Leo was notified. The building's flow adjusted to the package before anyone fully understood what it was. When the briefcase was placed on the improvised meeting table in the lobby, some employees stopped to look. Others pretended not to see. Dean kept cleaning, but his eyes never left it. That he noticed the engraved symbols, the small panels, the lines that seemed to follow a pattern. Nothing there was random, that much he knew. The courier explained very little. That he said it was a confidential item. That he said it could only be opened under specific conditions. That he said any wrong attempt could result in total loss of the contents. No force. No tools. Just logic. Just precision. Those words immediately caught Leo's attention. Total loss was not an acceptable risk. Confidentiality sparked interest. And anything wrapped in mystery tends to attract power. Leo stepped closer with the look of an owner. As if it already belonged to him. While the adults discussed procedures, Dean ran calculations in his head. That he watched the digital panel. Noticed light intervals, blinking sequences. Nothing screamed a solution, but everything suggested a rule. That he felt the same sensation he used to feel at school. That invisible order. That silent promise that if you looked closely enough, it would make sense. But no one asked him anything. No one asked if he saw something. That he was just the boy with the cleaning cloth in his hand. And that, in that moment, seemed to keep him safe. Leo decided the case would be taken to a larger room. That he didn't want too many curious eyes. But curiosity had already been planted, the doors closed, conversations lowered, and the entire building began to feel a strange anticipation. As if something big was about to happen. Dean went back to work, but time now moved differently. Each minute seemed to carry new suspense. And without knowing why, he felt that briefcase hadn't arrived there by chance. As if it had been waiting for the right place, and the wrong person to underestimate it. Because that case didn't bring just contents. It brought a test. And tests don't choose resumes, they choose readiness. Dean still didn't know what was inside. But something told him that when it was revealed, titles wouldn't be what mattered. What would matter was who could see beyond the surface. And that was already creating enough tension to change everything. The room fell silent when the first documents were opened. There was no theatrical suspense, only the tension of people who understood numbers too large to be ignored. Leo read once, then read again. His eyes didn't widen, but his body reacted, his posture changed, the air seemed heavier. It wasn't every day you read something of that magnitude. The contents of the case were not jewelry or physical cash, they were papers. And papers, when they're the right ones, are worth more than vaults. They were worth $8 billion. The documents explained that they were bearer bonds, rare assets. Old, discreet, difficult to trace. Money that doesn't ask for explanations. Money that crosses borders in silence, the kind of inheritance that only appears in strange stories. They belonged to a distant uncle, eccentric, reclusive, known for challenging rules, and for never fully trusting anyone, not even his own family. The inheritance was not simple. It was never meant to be. The uncle had left clear instructions. The case could only be opened if the correct method was followed. No force. No shortcuts. Any mistake would trigger an internal self-destruction system. The bonds would be destroyed. No second chances. No recovery. It was all or nothing. And time was not on anyone's side. Pressure spread through the room. Leo felt something rare, anxiety. Not because of the money itself, but because of control. He was facing something too big to command, too big to intimidate. Here, power did not respond to voice. It responded to logic. And that deeply unsettled him. He wanted to open the case quickly. He wanted to show dominance. He wanted to solve it. but the instructions didn't allow haste. And that wounded his ego in a new way, a dangerous way. The executives began exchanging looks. 8 billion changed any dynamic. Changed alliances, changed moods, changed priorities. The entire building seemed to revolve around that number. Employees whispered in the hallways. No one spoke loudly, but everyone knew. Something enormous was at stake, and no one wanted to be responsible for losing it all. Failure was not an option, but the solution was still unclear. And that left everyone uneasy. Meanwhile, outside the room, Dean wiped the floor more carefully than ever. He didn't know the exact amount, but he heard numbers too big to ignore. Billions don't fit in a child's mind, but they fit in imagination. And he imagined medicine. He imagined food. He imagined school. He imagined a world where effort had a return. But he quickly pushed the thought away. That wasn't for him. It wasn't meant for someone like him. That's what they always said. Bia watched everything with discomfort. She knew that case would change people. She knew the money hadn't even been touched yet, but it was already altering behavior. Leo spoke differently, the executives walked differently, the building breathed differently, and no one seemed to notice how fragile it all was. It depended on a correct sequence. On a prepared mind. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't in the hands everyone expected. But it was still too early to say. Because along with the inheritance came a condition, and the condition was cruel. Cruel enough to separate those who command from those who understand. Cruel enough to expose arrogance, and that part of the story was still to come, along with the first major mistake. The reading continued, but the atmosphere was no longer one of curiosity. It was one of alert. The instructions left no room for comfortable interpretation. The uncle had been far too clear. The case did not accept attempts. It accepted understanding. Each lock responded only to the exact answer. There was no margin for error. There was no, almost. Either it was right or everything would be lost. And the coldness of that warning froze the room. The mechanism worked in levels. Each stage unlocked the next point. One mistake ended everything. The documents explain this without emotion, like someone describing the weather. No second chances. No external intervention. No extra time. The uncle believed that money without intelligence was waste. And that inheritance should not be an automatic reward. It should be a test that selected those who truly deserved to reach the end. Even if no one there liked that idea. Leo felt the provocation personally. This wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a silent judgment. As if someone from the past were questioning his ability. And Leo did not accept being questioned. He commented with disdain that it was exaggerated. Said they just needed to call in the best people. Said it would be solved quickly. But the truth was he was unsettled. Not by the complexity, but by the possibility of failing in front of everyone. The risk wasn't only financial. It was symbolic. The puzzles involved mathematics, logic, and abstract patterns. No physical force. No improvisation. Everything required calm, careful reading, the ability to recognize hidden structures, the kind of challenge that can't be solved by barking orders. Or by pressuring people. The case didn't respond to authority. It responded to reasoning. And that created a new kind of tension. A tension no one there knew how to handle properly. Because they were used to commanding, not deciphering. Some executives began to show insecurity. They asked if the system could be copied. If it could be simulated. If there were loopholes. The answers were always the same. No, no, and no. The uncle had thought of everything. Any external attempt would trigger the destruction protocol. It was as if the case had its own personality. A distrustful personality, and impatient with shortcuts. The more they tried to get around it, the clearer it became that there was no way. It was solve it or lose everything. Meanwhile, outside the room, Dean was cleaning near the door and overhearing fragments. Words like sequence, pattern, logic reached him, and each one sounded familiar. Not like a threat, but like an invitation. He didn't understand the full context. But he understood the language. That language didn't intimidate him. It organized things. And for the first time since he had left school, Dean felt something close to excitement. Quick. Contained, like recognizing an old friend from a distance. But not approaching. Bia watched Leo move restlessly. He wanted immediate results. He wanted to show dominance. But he was trapped in a game he didn't control, and that was starting to bother him deeply. The entire building felt the pressure growing, because everyone knew someone would make a mistake. The question wasn't if. It was when, and who would be nearby when it happened. The case was at the center. But the test had started long before anyone touched it. The uncle's cruel condition wasn't only about money. It was about character, about patience, about intellectual humility, and those qualities were not distributed according to job titles. That wasn't clear to everyone yet, but it was about to become clear. Because the next step would be to place trust where it was always placed. In specialists. In titles. In resumes. And when that failed, there would be no way to pretend surprise. The first team entered the room with rehearsed confidence. Long resumes, expensive degrees, years of experience with complex problems. They positioned themselves around the case like doctors facing a rare condition. They spoke in technical terms, acronyms, foreign references. Everything sounded sophisticated. Leo watched with his arms crossed, certain it was only a matter of time. To him, this was routine. Qualified people solving difficult things. The mistake was believing that qualification always means understanding, and the case didn't take long to expose that. The first puzzle seemed far too simple for people who called themselves experts. A numerical sequence projected on the panel. Some laughed. They said it was basic. Someone suggested a quick, almost automatic solution. The answer was entered with little discussion. The panel flashed red. A short warning appeared. Invalid attempt. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the smiles vanished, silence stepped in. And confidence took a step back. The second group chose to be more cautious. They wrote down numbers, drew diagrams, researched historical references, tried to cross known patterns. Hours passed, the air grew heavy, the coffee went cold, the room began to smell like frustration. Each new attempt came with a long justification. As if explaining the mistake could cancel it. But the panel remained unmoved. It didn't accept excuses. It didn't accept effort. Only correct answers. Leo began to lose patience. He asked how much longer they needed, questioned their methods, criticized their approaches, but none of that helped. Pressure doesn't create logic. Shouting doesn't solve equations, and the more he interfered, the more he got in the way. The executives grew confused, skipped steps, ignored details, haste became the enemy, and fear of making a mistake began to create bigger mistakes. The kind born from wounded ego. They tried intellectual brute force. They tried controlled random combinations. They tried deducing answers from the system's reaction time. Nothing worked. Each failure was recorded. Each invalid attempt increased the risk of losing everything. The tension kept rising. Someone suggested stopping. Another said they couldn't stop now. 8 billion doesn't wait. And that urgency started to blind them. No one was thinking clearly anymore. They were thinking with fear. Outside the room, the building murmured, doors opened and closed. Employees whispered in the corridors, the story leaked without effort. When a lot of money is involved, secrecy always fails. Dean was cleaning near the room, hearing scattered phrases. Nothing works. They've tried everything. This makes no sense. Each phrase sounded strange to him. Because to Dean, when something doesn't make sense, it usually means people are looking at it the wrong way. But he didn't say anything. Not yet. Hours piled up with no progress. The panel remained closed. Untouched. As if it were watching. As if it were waiting for something different. Leo no longer hid his irritation. This was starting to feel like humiliation. Not because of the money but because of the exposure. Experts failing in front of a silent object. A case challenging egos. And winning. The initial confidence had turned into collective embarrassment. And no one knew how to get out of that situation. When the last executive sighed and stepped back from the table, it became clear that something was wrong. Not with the case, but with the people trying to open it. The method wasn't working, the approach wasn't working, and insisting would only make it worse. Leo looked around, irritated, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Exposure. That he was being watched, judged. And the entire building was beginning to realize that power there had limits. A limit that didn't respond to titles. Or positions. Or money. And when those in charge fail in public, a void appears. An uncomfortable silence demanding an urgent solution. Leo needed to turn the game around. He needed to prove he was still in control. And it was in that space of disguised desperation that a dangerous idea began to form. An idea that would turn everything into a spectacle. And place someone unexpected at the center. The news spread faster than any official announcement. It didn't come by email or through a meeting. It came through whispers, through quick messages on cell phones, through sideways glances in the hallway. The vault wouldn't open. The specialist had failed, and the money remained locked inside. The building, which had always functioned like a finely tuned machine, now vibrated like a live wire. Everyone felt it. Employees who never spoke to each other began to talk. People from different departments exchanged information like old acquaintances. The story changed on every floor. Some said the system was impossible. Others said there was sabotage. Others swore Leo was hiding something. The fact was one and the same. Nothing was moving forward, and when nothing moves at the top, the entire base grows restless. The atmosphere of luxury gave way to an anxiety that was hard to disguise. The building was in collective suspense. Leo felt it in the air. Every time he walked down a corridor he noticed the stares lingering longer. They were not looks of respect. And that bothered him deeply, that he was used to being the reference point for solutions, for decisions, for command. Now he was the center of a public problem, and public problems erode authority. That he began to feel something rare, shame. Not admitted, not spoken, but present. And it made him even more aggressive. The tension turned small details into triggers. Slamming doors felt like provocations. Quiet conversations sounded like judgment. Leo demanded silence, but silence no longer obeyed. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more it slipped away. Because big stories don't belong to one person alone. They belong to those who watch, and there were too many observers. The entire building followed the stalemate as if it were an inevitable spectacle. Something no one wanted to miss. Bia realized the situation was slipping out of control. She saw employees moving closer to the room just to listen. She saw phones discreetly raised. She saw curiosity turn into tension, and tension turn into expectation. She knew Leo hated this kind of exposure. The kind that doesn't quiet down with orders. The kind that grows precisely when someone tries to hide it. Something needed to happen. A conclusion. Anything to break that state. Because the longer it dragged on, the worse it would get, and Leo felt that too. His pride was starting to hurt more than the financial risk. It wasn't just the money trapped inside. It was his image. It was the myth of the untouchable owner beginning to crack. He thought about how to turn the game around. How to turn failure into control. And when no logical exit appears, people like Leo resort to spectacle.to, exaggeration.to, humiliating someone else. Because shifting the focus is a form of defense. And it was in that line of thinking that a cruel idea began to take shape. An idea that would draw laughter, but demand a heavy price later. Meanwhile, Dean remained in the hallway, watching, listening, noticing the unusual movement. He felt that something was wrong, but he also felt there was a pattern in that chaos. The tension followed cycles. The conversations repeated the same words: error, failure, sequence. Nothing worked. To him, it sounded less like impossibility and more like the wrong approach. But no one asked what he thought, and he didn't offer. Not yet. The entire building seemed to hold its breath. As if waiting for someone to stumble. Or someone to surprise everyone. And Leo, pressured from all sides, finally decided to speak out loud, not to solve the problem, but to provoke. To reclaim the center of the stage. And when he opened his mouth, he had no idea he was about to hand over his own authority to the person he respected the least. The show was about to begin. As the tension grew, Dean didn't stay in place out of fear. He stayed in place out of habit. The cloth moved back and forth at the same rhythm, almost automatic. But his mind was far from there. It was stuck on the images he had caught in quick glances on the panel. Sequences that repeated, intervals that weren't random, lights blinking with logic. Nothing there felt confusing to him. It felt misinterpreted. Like a simple problem being solved the wrong way, and that bothered him. Dean remembered his old classes, the exercises that seemed difficult until someone changed the point of view. Sometimes the answer was in the order, not the value. Sometimes in the interval, not the number. He thought about that while scrubbing the floor. Each step down the hallway became a count. Each sign became a reference. Without realizing it, he rebuilt the puzzle in his head, not with technical terms, but with trained intuition. The kind that's born from watching a lot and speaking little. The kind that survives when there's no paper and too much silence. He noticed that the executives were trapped in ready-made formulas. They searched for complexity where there was simplicity. They tried to impress the system when the system only wanted to be understood. Dean saw that the first sequence ignored something basic. The numbers didn't grow at random. They followed a simple rule. But no one seemed willing to look again, because looking again requires humility. And humility rarely lives in glass rooms. He felt the urge to speak, but swallowed it. Dean knew the place he occupied. He knew no one expected a contribution from him, least of all in something so important. But the pattern was too clear to ignore. He repeated the sequence in his mind, tested possibilities, discarded hypotheses. In a few minutes he was sure of something. Not of the final solution, but of the correct path, and that made him restless. Because watching a mistake repeat itself hurts. Even more when you know how to avoid it, but have no voice. Bia noticed something different about him. It wasn't direct eye contact, but the absence of distraction. Dean wasn't just cleaning. He was thinking, focused in a way that didn't match the scene. She remembered the stories she had heard about school, about math, and felt a strange chill. As if a piece had finally fallen into place. but it was still too early to say anything, and saying anything could make things worse. Inside the room, new attempts failed. The panel remained indifferent. The specialists looked tired. Confused. Dean watched the system's reactions. Not the human responses that he noticed small changes, a longer processing time, a different sound when rejecting an entry. Details no one commented on, because no one was looking to listen. They were looking to win, and that changes everything. Dean's mind worked the way it did when he solved problems in a notebook, that he didn't start at the end, that he started with the pattern. And the pattern was there. Silently screaming, that he realized the panel didn't reject everything the same way. Some attempts almost passed. Others didn't come close. That wasn't random, IT was feedback. And feedback is language, you just have to know how to listen. Dean was listening. His heart started beating faster. Not out of fear, out of recognition that IT was like finding something he had lost. Something he thought he'd left behind at school. But it was there, alive. Working, that he didn't know what he would do with that. But he knew one thing, that if someone let him try, he wouldn't fail by chance, that he would only fail if he were prevented from thinking. And that was about to be tested. Because outside the room, Leo was finally losing his patience completely. And when pride meets desperation, it looks for an easy target. Someone to turn failure into a joke. And without realizing it, his gaze began to shift in the wrong direction. Toward the only person who was actually seeing something. Leo took a deep breath before speaking, like someone deciding to turn tension into a spectacle that he hated, silence he couldn't control. And in that moment, the entire building seemed to be waiting for something from him. So he decided to speak out loud, that he said that the stalemate had gone on long enough, that he said the solution needed to appear. And he announced in a firm and calculated voice that whoever managed to open the vault would take $100 million. Not as a reward, but as a provocation. The offer echoed through the corridors like a spark in gasoline. $100 million isn't just money, that it's a promise, that it's madness, that it's temptation. Employees stopped what they were doing. Some laughed, thinking it was exaggerated. Others widened their eyes, doing impossible math. The building stopped being a company and turned into an arena. Leo liked that he liked seeing reactions. That was how he took back control. By turning the problem into a public challenge. And failure into entertainment. He explained that anyone could no restriction of position, no distinction of role, as long as the rules were followed. The vault remained the same. Impassive, the risk remained absolute. But now there was an audience. And an audience changes everything. Curiosity beat fear for some. Common sense won for others. No one moved right away. Because big money scares as much as it attracts. And failing in front of everyone weighs more than failing alone. Some employees whispered about trying. Others dismissed the idea immediately. This isn't for regular people. This is for specialists. It's a trap. The phrases spread quickly. Leo watched every reaction closely. He didn't want someone to solve it, he wanted someone to fail. To prove the problem wasn't his. But the challenges. The prize was real. But the intention was vanity, and that made all the difference. Bia felt immediate discomfort. That announcement wasn't a solution. It was exposure. It was pressure disguised as opportunity. She noticed the gleam in Leo's eyes. It wasn't hope. It was a challenge. As if he were saying to the entire building, see how no one is capable. She looked around for Dean, and saw him standing there, attentive, listening to everything. He didn't react like the others. He didn't smile. He didn't get scared. He just thought. And that stood out. Dean felt the weight of the offer in a different way. $100 million didn't turn into a mansion in his mind. It turned into medicine. It turned into school. It turned into time for his father to sit without pain. It turned into rest for his mother. But he didn't step forward. He didn't say anything. He knew that announcement wasn't a sincere invitation. It was a social trap. A stage set to humiliate someone. And he knew that kind of stage well. He had been on it before. Without applause, without choice. Some people approached the vault. Looked. Read the instructions, stepped back. The panel seemed even more hostile now, as if it could feel the human pressure. Quick attempts were ruled out. No one wanted to be the first to fail in public. Nervous laughter began to appear. And with it, embarrassment. Leo pretended patience, but inside he felt frustration. The spectacle still hadn't paid off. He needed something bigger, bolder, crueler. That's when his gaze crossed the lobby again, not looking for a solution, looking for contrast, and he found Dean. Small, quiet, out of place in that scene, the perfect contrast. The idea formed quickly, too quickly, and when Leo smirked, it became clear that the $100 million wasn't the end of the show, and that someone would be used to get laughs, even if it cost dignity. Leo took a few steps forward, deliberately letting the silence grow. He liked to control time before words. His gaze swept over the gathered people, assessing reactions, measuring nerves. Then he pointed, with far too much ease, at someone who was never meant to be noticed. At Dean. The gesture was simple, almost casual. But the effect was immediate. Some laughed without understanding. Others took a second to realize. And when they did, the discomfort spread. Leo spoke in a loud voice, heavy with irony. He said that if even that boy managed to open the vault, he would pay 500 million. Not 100.500. That the number came out like a joke. Like deliberate exaggeration. Like a way of saying it would never happen. Some employees laughed out loud. Others covered their mouths. Some lowered their heads. But no one interrupted. The spectacle was set. And Leo was the host. The laughter wasn't just about money. It was about hierarchy. About who is allowed to try and who is born to watch. Dean felt heat rise to his face. Not from shame, from unexpected attention. He was never the center. Never chosen. And now he was, but in the worst possible way. As an example of the impossible. As a living joke. He heard side comments. Saw phones being raised. Felt the weight of the collective stare. It was humiliation disguised as humor. And everyone knew it. Bia tried to react, but it was too late. The laughter had already spread. Any intervention now would seem exaggerated. And Leo knew that he knew how to use the moment. He reinforced the provocation, saying it was just a joke. That no one needed to take it seriously, but he repeated the amount. Repeated the condition. And by repeating it, turned it into a public challenge. Now if Dean backed away, he would confirm the joke. If he stepped forward, he would become the official clown. It was a perfect trap. And Leo smiled, satisfied. Dean felt his heart pound, not with fear, with clarity. He understood the game instantly. Understood that this wasn't about a chance. It was about humiliation. But he also understood something deeper. That challenge had slipped out of Leo's control. Because unlike what everyone thought, Dean wasn't there by accident. He knew the panel. He knew the patterns. And now he had something he had never had before. Total attention. Even if it was cruel. Even if it was unfair. The laughter began to fade little by little. Not because anyone felt remorse. But because something in Dean's gaze changed. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't asking to leave. He was simply looking at the vault. Like someone looking at an old problem. A familiar one. Some noticed. Others ignored it. But the atmosphere began to shift. The laughter lost strength, and expectation took its place. Because when someone being humiliated doesn't react as expected, something falls out of the script. Leo was still laughing. But it was a laugh louder than it was confident. He needed to sustain the character. Needed to show he was in control, but control had already slipped a little. Silently, without warning, and now, everyone waited for the boy's reaction. The spectacle demanded an answer, and Dean, at the center of a stage he never chose, was about to do something no one there had anticipated. Marta was a few meters back when she heard the laughter. She recognized that sound. It wasn't laughter of joy. It was laughter that hurts. Her body went cold before she even understood why. When she saw everyone looking at the same point, when she recognized her son at the center of the attention, her heart tightened in an almost physical way. Marta felt the immediate urge to run.to grab Dean by the arm.to pull him out of there. But her feet wouldn't move. She heard the amount $500 million and in that same instant, she knew it wasn't serious. It was cruelty wrapped in exaggeration. The kind of joke powerful people make when they want to remind someone of their place. Marta felt her face burn, not from shame of her son, but from knowing exactly what they were trying to do to him. She had seen this before. In other places with other people. Always the same way. Laugh first, explain later. Her maternal instinct screamed to protect him. To say no. To stop everything. But something paralyzed her. It wasn't fear of Leo. It was fear of breaking Dean on the inside. She knew that if she pulled him away by force, she would confirm to everyone that he had no choice, that he was fragile, that he needed to be saved. And Marta knew her son. She knew he hated being treated as incapable. Even when he was tired. Even when he was overwhelmed. He had a quiet pride, and she didn't want to crush that. Marta took one step forward, then another, but she stopped, because Dean turned his head and saw her. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a big gesture. Just a small motion with his hand. A silent request. Trust me. That gesture hurt more than any words, because it carried maturity far beyond a boy's age, and more trust than an exhausted mother felt she deserved. Marta felt her eyes fill, but she took a deep breath. She knew this was a moment she could not control. She remembered all the nights sewing clothes, all the mornings leaving early, all the times she apologized for not being able to give more. Dean never complained. never asked for anything beyond what was necessary, and now he was there, exposed not because of ambition, but because someone decided to make an example of him. That split Marta in two. Because she knew that, no matter the outcome, that moment would stay with him forever, and with her too. The noise around her felt distant. Marta heard voices but couldn't make out the words. The world had shrunk to the size of her son. She thought about interrupting, thought about shouting, thought about begging, but none of those options felt right. Everything felt wrong, and when everything feels wrong, sometimes the only choice is to respect the one at the center. Even if it hurts, even if it's frightening, even if it feels insane. Marta pressed her hands together, closed her eyes for a second, and chose to trust, not the system, not the people there, but the boy she had raised, the boy who learned too early how to observe, think, endure. She didn't know if it would end well, but she knew that stopping him now would mean denying everything he was, and that for her would be worse than any public humiliation. When Marta opened her eyes, Dean had already taken a step forward, not on impulse, but by decision, and in that moment she understood that the challenge was no longer just about the vault. It was about dignity, and when dignity is at stake there is no turning back. Dean took a deep breath before speaking. It wasn't a nervous sigh, it was an internal adjustment. Like someone organizing their thoughts before a difficult problem. The noise around him felt distant now. Laughter, whispers, raised phones. None of that mattered in that moment. He looked at Leo without lowering his head, not in defiance, with clarity. And asked the simplest question possible. If it was serious. If the promise truly stood. Leo smiled, amused by the boy's formality. He said yes, said everything was there in front of everyone, said a man's word was worth more than paper. Some laughed again. Others grew attentive. Dean didn't move yet. He asked again, confirmed the amount, confirmed the condition, confirmed that no one would stop him afterward. Each question seemed unnecessary to those watching, but for Dean, it was essential that he didn't enter a game without understanding the rules. When Leo answered the second time with a slight tone of impatience, something shifted in the room. The provocation began to slip out of control. Because the boy was no longer reacting like a victim. He was reacting like someone taking responsibility. Dean nodded slowly. Didn't smile. Didn't thank him. He simply said he accepted. The word came out firm. No tremor. No theatrics. Accepted. And that sound crossed the lobby with more weight than any previous laughter. Some people stopped laughing immediately. Others exchanged confused looks. This wasn't supposed to happen. The script had predicted embarrassment, had predicted retreat. It hadn't predicted conscious consent. Dean took another step forward. Now he was close to the vault. The panel glowed in front of him, not like a threat, but like an old invitation. He felt a slight chill in his stomach. Not fear, focus. The kind of concentration that pushes the world away. Bia felt her heart race. She wanted to intervene, wanted to say it was absurd, but something made her stop. Dean's demeanor, his posture, the organized silence. He didn't look lost. He looked prepared, and that was terrifying and impressive at the same time. Because no one there had seen this before. No one had truly looked, and now it was too late to pretend it wasn't happening. Leo still held his smile, but it was no longer comfortable. It was the smile of someone who has to sustain the bet. Backing down now would mean admitting a mistake, and Leo never admitted mistakes. So he made a broad, theatrical gesture. Like someone handing over the stage. He said the boy could try, said everyone was watching, said it would be quick. Some laughed nervously. Others began filming more intently. The circus had a full audience. Dean brought his hands close to the panel. He didn't touch it yet. He observed, repeated the sequences in his mind. He knew this wasn't just a test of logic. It was a test of calm. And calm he had learned early, learned through lack, learned in silence, learned out of necessity. When he finally placed his fingers on it, the entire building seemed to stop. And the first step was about to be taken. No turning back. No rehearsal. No second chance. As soon as Dean positioned himself in front of the vault, the atmosphere changed tone. It was no longer just curiosity, it was active anticipation. Employees moved closer without realizing it. Phones appeared from all sides, discreet at first, then without restraint. Someone whispered that this was going to go wrong. Another commented that it was a waste of time. The laughter returned, now mixed with anxiety. The lobby stopped being a workspace and became an audience. And Leo, satisfied, assumed the role of conductor of that cruel spectacle. He guided everyone's gaze like someone directing an improvised show. Leo made loud comments, pretending lightness. He said it was all just to break the tension. That no one needed to take it seriously. But he repeated the bet whenever he could point 500 million as if the number itself were part of the joke as if he were rubbing the impossible in a boy's face. Each phrase drew reactions. Nervous laughter. Improvised bets. People rooting for failure, not success. Because failure would confirm the natural order of things. And the natural order always comforts those at the top. Dean felt the stares as a physical weight on his back. But he didn't take his focus off the panel that he knew any distraction would be costly. That he ignored the comments. Ignored his own name being twisted and repeated. Ignored the noise around him. For him, now there were only numbers, lights, and logic. That it was as if the world had shrunk to that illuminated rectangle. Everything else became noise. And this ability to shut inward had been trained through years of invisibility. Some employees stepped closer, curious. Others filmed openly, some rooted in silence. Others wished for immediate failure. The circus needs a fall to work. Without a fall, there is no laughter. And without laughter, the spectacle loses meaning. Leo watched it all with calculated attention. That he didn't touch the vault, that didn't interfere, that he simply waited. Waited for the mistake. Waited for confirmation of his own superiority. Bia felt her stomach twist. She watched cruelty turn into entertainment. Saw good people being pulled into the collective mood. Saw phones replace empathy. And wondered how they had reached that point. Dean was just a boy. But there he had become a character. And characters don't receive care. They receive judgment. She wanted to scream for them to stop. But she knew no one would listen. The spectacle had already passed the point of no return. Dean began interacting with the panel. That he didn't type anything yet. That he simply navigated the initial screens. Read instructions. Observed the system's responses. That he noticed that the vault reacted to every touch. Not with urgency. But with precision. That confirmed something he had already suspected. The system didn't want to be beaten. That it wanted to be understood. And that difference was everything. That he felt a slight sense of relief. That he was on the right path. Leo, impatient, threw out a provocation. Asked if the boy needed help. Some laughter followed. Dean didn't respond. Not out of disrespect. But because responding would break his focus. And focus was the only shield he had in that moment. His silence was unsettling. Because concentrated silence doesn't fit public humiliation. That he seemed too calm. Too prepared. And that began to change the atmosphere. The circus was still set. But something was slipping out of control. That it was no longer just laughter. That it was genuine curiosity. Some stopped filming and began to truly observe. The panel awaited the first input. And when Dean raised his finger to type, the entire lobby held its breath. Because now it was no longer a joke. That it was a real attempt. And the first response was about to happen. Dean took one last breath before touching the panel. That it was encouraged. That it was method. That he ignored the faces around him and fixed his eyes on the sequence displayed. Numbers aligned in a way that was too simple for those looking for complexity. That he remembered his old classes, when the teacher used to say the most common mistake was complicating the obvious. The numbers didn't ask for a long formula. They asked for recognition. And the pattern became clear in his mind. Prime numbers.order.no trick.no. Dean typed slowly, not to build suspense, but to avoid mistakes. Each number went in as if it had already been written before. The panel took a second longer than in the previous attempts. The light didn't turn red. It didn't flash an alert. That a different sound echoed through the lobby. Low. Short, precise. Like an internal click. And for the first time since the vault had arrived there, something changed. The screen turned blue. A line of text appeared. Level 1 completed. For a moment, no one reacted. As if the collective mind had frozen. The silence was absolute. No laughter. No comments. No phones moving. It was the kind of silence that only appears when the impossible takes a step forward. Dean didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his arms. He simply confirmed mentally what he already knew. The path was right. Bia covered her mouth without realizing it. Her heart raced. She felt a mix of relief and shock. That it wasn't luck. That it wasn't a guess. That it was correct reading. She looked at Leo. And for the first time she didn't see control. She saw confusion. She saw hurried recalculation. She saw the owner of the spectacle realizing he had lost the script. His smile didn't come back. That it froze on his face. Like something forgotten in the middle of a sentence. Some employees stepped closer, not to laugh, but to understand. Someone murmured that it couldn't be real. Another said there had to be a trick. But the panel was there. Indifferent to opinions. Confirming the progress. Confirming that someone had gotten it right. Dean felt the weight of the environment change. Now the looks weren't mocking, they were tense with expectation. Because if the first level fell, the others no longer seemed impossible. Leo cleared his throat, trying to recover his tone. That he said it was a coincidence. That he said the first level was just a warm-up. But no one laughed. Because the system didn't react that way to coincidences. The sound had been different, the response had been clean, and everyone knew it. Even without admitting it, the invisible boy had passed where specialists failed, and that was too big to ignore. Too big to turn into a joke. Dean moved on to the next screen. Not on impulse. On continuity. He knew the box didn't reward celebration. It rewarded focus. New sequences appeared, more complex. Longer, but still familiar. He recognized shapes he had seen scribbled in old notebooks. Patterns that grow from the numbers themselves, and the real challenge began now. Level 1 had been just the door. The entire building felt it. Something had shifted. The story no longer belonged to those who commanded. It belonged to those who got it right. And when logic starts to defeat ego, there is no shout that can regain control. The next step would require more than luck. It would require deep understanding. And Dean was ready to continue. The panel changed in form, not in intention. Now the numbers came with symbols. Curved lines, regular spaces. Sequences that didn't grow in a straight line. Dean tilted his head slightly, the way he did when something required a different angle. It wasn't simple addition. It was organized growth. He recognized it fast. Fibonacci. Not as a memorized formula, but as rhythm. Each number was born from the one before. Nothing there stood alone. Everything depended on what came earlier. Dean touched the panel with more confidence now. Not because he felt too sure of himself, but because he was sure about the path that he entered. The missing values, respecting the progression. The system took longer this time. As if it were checking carefully, the sound returned. Longer, deeper. Another message appeared. Level 2 completed. The silence cracked into restrained murmurs. There was no applause, there was disbelief. And disbelief weighs more than laughter. Leo took an involuntary step back. Not everyone noticed, but anyone paying attention did. He wasn't commenting anymore. He wasn't provoking. He watched in rigid silence. The game had stopped being funny. Now it was too serious to be treated like a joke. The problem was that serious required admitting something Leo didn't want to admit, that control had changed hands. And there was no way back without looking weak. So he stayed still, waiting for the mistake that needed to happen. The third level appeared without a pause. This time, it wasn't just numbers. It was geometric shapes tied to values. Perfect squares, visual relationships. Symmetry. Dean felt his heart speed up a little. Not from fear, from the higher demand for attention. He scanned the figures like someone reading a map. Each shape pointed to an operation. Nothing was there to confuse. It was there to test whether he truly understood. And he did. Dean didn't type right away. He calculated in his head, compared areas, connected positions, recognized the hidden pattern. Perfect squares repeated at exact intervals. The answer wasn't big. It was precise. He entered the corresponding numbers with absolute calm. The panel responded almost instantly, different from the earlier checks. As if it were satisfied. Level 3 completed. The confirmation sounded too clean to ignore. The lobby was no longer a circus. It was a silent courtroom. Phones were recording now without commentary. There were no more laughs. There was shock. Employees exchanged looks, not knowing what to say. Some felt ashamed for having laughed earlier. Others tried to understand how it was even possible. Bia felt her legs weaken. Not from fear, from contained emotion. She realized she was witnessing something rare, not a miracle, but an injustice being corrected in real time. Dean pulled his hands back slightly from the panel. He breathed. He knew the early levels existed to separate the curious from the careful readers. The real test was still coming, and the system made that clear. The next screen carried fewer numbers and more words. Pure logic.no, calculations.no, symbols. Just understanding. The kind of problem that reveals more about a mind than about schooling. And when Dean read the final question, he knew that was the decisive point. Because there, it wasn't enough to. No math, you just had to think right. The screen went white for a moment, as if asking for absolute silence. When the text appeared, there were no numbers, no formulas, no symbols. Just simple words, arranged in an almost innocent way. It was the kind of question that confuses those looking for a trick and clarifies things for those who read calmly. Dean read it once. Then he read it again. Not because it was difficult, but because he knew this was the final trap. A trap made of haste. The question spoke about a man, his son, and that son's father. Nothing more than that. No hidden trick. No extra information. Many adults there had seen similar riddles before, and many failed precisely because they tried to be too clever. Dean didn't try to be clever. He simply followed direct logic. If Diego's father is someone, then that father's son can only be Diego. That's it. No return. No alternative interpretation. The answer didn't ask for creativity. It asked for attention. Dean felt his heart pound, not from doubt, but from awareness of the moment that he knew that answer ended everything. Either it stopped there, or it changed everything from that point on. He typed the name carefully, letter by letter, without looking around, without seeking approval. The screen took a second longer than usual, the longest second in the entire building, and then the sound came. It wasn't a beep. It wasn't an alert. It was a deep, metallic, definitive click, the kind of sound that can't be mistaken. The screen changed color, green, and the words appeared too clearly to deny. Access granted. For an instant, no one breathed. It was as if the building had forgotten how to make noise. Dean didn't move. He simply closed his eyes for half a second. Not in celebration. In confirmation. It was over. The vault emitted a slight internal movement. The locks retracted one by one. No explosion. No drama. The door opened with silent dignity. Inside were the documents, intact, real. 0.8 billion waiting only for understanding. Bia pressed a hand to her chest. Someone dropped their phone, another muttered a low curse, but no one laughed. No one dared to laugh. Leo stood frozen, the color had drained from his face. There was no more irony. No more control. The joke had turned completely against him. He had bet on humiliation and lost in front of everyone, without being able to deny it, without being able to pretend, without being able to order it erased. Because the panel didn't lie, and the cameras were already far too active. Dean took a step back. He didn't touch the documents. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't ask for applause. He just looked at his mother. And in that look was everything: relief, exhaustion, and a silent question. What happens now? Because solving the impossible was one thing. Facing the world after that was the real next challenge. The silence didn't last long. Someone took a deep breath. Another started talking at the same time, and then the noise exploded all at once. Phones were already streaming. Videos began circulating before any official statement could be made. Poor boy opens impossible vault. Executives fail, child solves it. Billionaire humiliates and loses. The narrative spread faster than any lawyer could contain. The building became the setting for something bigger than money. It became a symbol. Leo tried to react the only way he knew how. First he minimized it. He said it could have been luck. Then he suggested outside help. He talked about coincidence. But every sentence made things worse, because the video showed everything: the provocation, the bet, the laughter, and the awkward silence afterward. Companies started calling. Partners demanded explanations. The board called for a meeting. For the first time, Leo didn't control the narrative. It was in the hands of the public. Under pressure, Leo called his lawyers. He wanted to know if he could void the promise. If there was a loophole. If the deal was valid. The answer was clear. Public promise, witnesses, recordings. There was no clean legal way out. But the heavier weight wasn't legal. It was moral. The internet wasn't discussing money. It was discussing character. And that hurt more than any financial loss. Because reputation can't be bought once it falls. That's when something unexpected happened. Alone, Leo went home that night, and for the first time in years he didn't call anyone. He sat in silence. And he remembered his own childhood, his mother cleaning other people's houses, the smell of harsh cleaning products on her hands, the quiet pride that he had erased that part of his story, but it came back whole, without asking permission, and this time, it couldn't be pushed away. The next day, Leo requested a formal meeting. No press. No spectacle. He called Marta. He called Dean. He called legal counsel. He called the board. He paid the 500 million. No discount. No delay. No hidden conditions. But he didn't stop there. He created an educational fund using a name he had never used before. Fundación Dignidad. Focused on invisible children like Dean. Not for marketing, but because now he knew exactly who they were. Marta received a dignified job, with fair pay, with humane hours. Dean returned to school, with a full scholarship, without needing to clean floors to exist. And the story stopped being just viral. It became a reference. A warning. An example. The building was never the same again, and neither was Leo. Because some defeats don't break you, they reveal you. This story isn't just about a vault. It's about how many times talent is ignored because it doesn't look important. How often intelligence is mistaken for appearance. How often laughter hides the fear of being surpassed. That if Dean hadn't been provoked, would he have remained invisible? How many Deans are out there right now, going unnoticed while they clean the floor of the world? Do you think money should decide who deserves opportunity? Or does ability speak louder, sooner or later? Comment below what this story made you feel, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories that make us see the world differently.